I alert the audience, though, to one aspect of those diagrams that was not perceptible, and that is that within every one of those countries, there is a very wide range of outcomes with respect to life expectancy. And that's, of course, particularly true in India, where you have a small segment of the population that's very wealthy, a suddenly very large middle class, hundreds of millions of people, and a remaining large segment that's impoverished, where the health statistics are much poorer. It is perhaps worth noting at this point, before we get into deeper discussion, that the opportunity to make better assessments of the health of the Indian population has been dramatically improved by the new means for identifying individuals with digital techniques, the so-called Aadhaar criteria, and I hope that the statistics from India will soon be much greater. I look at my own country, and we're not colored among those nations that have the highest life expectancy, in part because we have a large segment of our population that represents an underclass where the health statistics are much poorer. Life expectancy for low economic status people is about 20 years lower than expectancy for those who are in the upper middle classes. Let me return to your question, the question of vaccines and what kind of promise it has for populations and for controlling health. Let me start with one simple observation that relates this discussion to the prior discussion, namely the distinctions between applied science and basic science. You said the development of the smallpox vaccine. Well, in fact, development there was really just a matter of observation. No basic science was required. A number of people, especially William Jenner, noticed that smallpox did not kill women who took care of milking cows. They had a disease called cowpox related to smallpox, and if material from their very minor lesions that were the result of cowpox were given to normal infants, those so-called vaccinated individuals could be protected from smallpox. That required no elaborate scientific study, no basic research. In contrast, just to give one other example at the other end of the spectrum, hepatitis B virus causes disease throughout the world. Large numbers of people in India, Africa, the US, other places experienced infection. The cause of that infection was very difficult to understand until a Nobel laureate in 1976, Barack Bloomberg, undertook studies of strange proteins that might be found in the blood of individuals from around the world, a study that had nothing to do initially with hepatitis B virus. And he found something called the Australia antigen, which proved to be the major antigen, the major immune stimulant of hepatitis B virus. That virus could not be grown in cell culture, could not be used as a means of stimulating immunity. But thanks to the development of the recombinant DNA technology, which again was not developed to make vaccines, it was possible to make the so-called Australia antigen in a way that could be used as a vaccine. Here, India came into the picture because initially this vaccine was made by major pharmaceutical houses in the US. Great triumph because the approach to making the vaccine was one of the first dramatic contributions made by the recombinant DNA industry to global health, but the expense of making that vaccine still put it out of range for many people in the developing world. However, biotechnology industry, Shanti Pharmaceuticals, for example, in India, now the Serum Institute of India, produced the vaccine at a very low cost, and now, even in poor African countries, certainly throughout China, 70% of individuals in India receive this vaccine, and the incidence of new cases of hepatitis B has gone down dramatically. So these are examples of how basic science can contribute dramatically to development of vaccines against diseases that otherwise might still remain untreatable. You ask about what we can do to use the basic approach of vaccination to prevent the diseases that are causing the greatest morbidity and mortality throughout the world at the moment. And frankly, in many cases, we don't have as yet the prospect of making such vaccines. But in my own world of science, the world of oncology or cancer research, there are some important examples, one of which I've already mentioned, because there are viruses that are responsible for large numbers of cancers and cancer deaths throughout the world. One of those viruses is hepatitis B virus, and now we are in a position to vaccinate the entire world against hepatitis B virus and thereby control or reduce to zero the incidence of the kind of liver cancer that is caused by hepatitis B infection. There's another important example that I want to draw the audience's attention to, and that is the large number of cancers that are caused by the human papillomaviruses. Now, these viruses are responsible for a number of kinds of cancer, most commonly cervical cancer of women, but also a number of other cancers that affect men as well. These viruses come in a variety of strains, and it's been very difficult to develop a vaccine against the human papillomaviruses that protect individuals against most or all of the strains that cause cancer. But we now have vaccines available throughout the world at extremely high cost. They are used at a unacceptably low level, even in the US, where vaccination rates among young people has not yet approached the 80 or 90% we need to protect the population thoroughly. But this vaccine does have the potential to eliminate virtually all cases of cervical cancer. In this country, cervical cancer is the #1 cause of death from cancer in women, about equal to or slightly exceeding breast cancer. In the US, the numbers have been low because we have means of detecting the cancer at a very early stage, methods that are expensive and not widely used in the developing world or, for example, in India. So here is one place where the development of vaccines that are low cost, that are endorsed by the government, that are accepted by the public, can be a tremendous means to reduce the incidence of a chronic disease that is not normally transmitted in its advanced state, in its cancerous state from individual to individual, but is the result of a contagious virus that is transmitted mainly during sexual activity at younger ages. But I would like to point out a general irony in this conversation. We focused on vaccines, we've talked about food, and yet you showed us in the beginning that the great threats to global health are in chronic non-communicable diseases, and there's been an enormous shift recognized by the UN in its 2 general meetings on non-communicable diseases as worldwide threats to health. And I think it might be useful for us to move back to that general construct and to ask what can be done here in India, for example, where infectious disease has become a much smaller threat to health than it was, say, 50 years ago when I first came to India as a medical student, and most of the patients I saw had tuberculosis and other infectious diseases, and similar things have happened in many other countries that are developing stronger economies where life expectancy is a lot longer. There are remarkable opportunities in many areas of science, ranging from the basic science of pathophysiology of disease to development of therapeutics, to development of new preventive methods, to what someone referred to in the previous section as implementation science, to improve health more generally. Healthy economies are stronger economies. People who are living longer lives deserve, in my view, to live lives that are healthier and richer. And I don't mean simply financially better off, but also more enjoyable. And the combinations of genomics and that improved biochemistry and other and the development of better technologies through engineering and nanotechnology and other methods has changed quite dramatically our approach to chronic illness. There are enormous opportunities for scientists in India, especially given the strength of Indian science across many disciplines, to participate very actively in these areas. I'd like to single out a couple of things about what we might call implementation science that are very important. There are things we know that could dramatically reduce the toll of chronic illness in an aging population in India, especially among those who are becoming more affluent and are living longer lives free of infectious disease. Those include control of the use of tobacco. We know tobacco is an insidious factor in human disease. We've known that for a long time. It's not just cancer, it's also chronic lung disease and cardiovascular disease. We have some methods that work imperfectly for reducing the use of tobacco, but we really don't have the kind of deep understanding of what drives people to use tobacco that's necessary to make tobacco control truly effective. Even in the U.S., where the frequency of the use of tobacco has gone down from about 45% 40 or 50 years ago to about 19%, still leaves about about a fifth of the population as chronic users of tobacco, and that accounts for a very large percent of early onset cardiovascular disease and cancer. Similarly, obesity plays a major role in many of these chronic illnesses, including, to the surprise of many, cancer. About 20% of the morbidity and mortality burden of cancer is attributable to obesity, which is a major problem in the U.S. and becoming an increasing problem, as I think many of you know, here in India. And the control of tobacco, the appropriate use of certain kinds of drugs, all play a major role in reducing the incidence of some of these diseases. I'd like to make one special mention of drug use, and that is it's a two-edged sword. In India, even though there's acknowledgement of the need to palliate pain and disease, especially in cancer, it's very difficult for patients with advanced painful illnesses, especially cancers, to gain access to the benefits of the use of opiates like morphine. And there has been some adjustment recently in the rules that govern the use of opiates, but for those who are social scientists in the audience, interested in science policy, paying attention to how a very inexpensive and widely used drug like morphine can be made more available to people with chronic illnesses that are extraordinarily painful, so that palliative medicine can be practiced here, is an extraordinary challenge that I would argue may not be the depth of molecular biology, but it's a very important aspect of how we use evidence-based decision-making to guide the way society regulates drugs like morphine that have both dangerous consequences and great human benefit.
Taking its name from the abundance of simul, or red silk cotton trees that bloom vividly here. The Simlipal National Park is home to 3 of India's biggest animal species: tiger, Asiatic elephant, and gaur. Spread over a sprawling area of 2,750 square kilometers, set on a wide expanse of sal forest, this park is nestled in the very center of Mayurbhanj in Odisha. It is one of the most breathtaking nature reserves in India, with forests, grassy meadows, and some beautiful waterfalls like Joranda and Badehipani. It is also home to an astounding 1,078 species of plants, including 94 species of orchids.
why it's important for India to actually do vaccine research itself. And it's because I participated in an awards ceremony given by the Infosys Foundation. And the winner of the Biomedical Science Award was a clinical scientist named Gagandeep Kang, who works at the Christian Medical College in Vellore. Now, she determined, now rotavirus is a virus that's responsible for a very large number of deaths in infants because it causes diarrhea. And she found that the rotavirus vaccine available didn't confer immunity in the same way in the Indian population as it did on the population in which the vaccine was tested. So she systematically looked at the reasons for it. She explored some of the biology of immunopathogenesis. And as a result, she's actually contributed to vaccine development as well as vaccine efficacy and evaluation, which is now being used by other countries such as China and Brazil. And as a result of her studies, not only has she saved or is in the process of saving really many thousands of lives, but she was also elected a member of the, one of the few Indians to be elected a foreign member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And you know, a great role model for women scientists and for clinician scientists. So this is something that would not be possible had not a group in India systematically done research and explored vaccine efficacy. Now, this is a case where vaccine was available in the West, but there are other diseases for which vaccine development in the West may not be, you know, a priority. There are diseases, you know, which are prevalent particularly in tropical countries. I mean, dengue fever is one of them. So there are many cases where, you know, medical research in India needs to be done, you know, in order to solve problems here, which lead to interesting biology as well. Certainly, many parts of India, including southern India, have a very large co-sanguineous population, which at the same time has very large diversity. For example, Africa also has large diversity, but it's not as co-sanguineous as you know, parts of southern India. And this actually, you know, it may create problems in one sense, but on the other hand, it's also a unique opportunity for genomic studies and identifying, you know, disease markers and susceptibilities and so on. So there certainly seems to be a lot of interest in that, and it's an area where working in India has some unique advantages.
I'd like to hear more comments from the panel, and we also welcome Steve first.
Yeah, so you know, the Royal Society just put out a statement on genetically modified organisms, and it was very interesting, the reaction that I got. I had to appear on a few interviews with the BBC and other places. And if you look on the web, you'll see blogs like Venki Ramakrishnan, liar, fool, or psychopath, you know, and I get lots of mails like this. Now, the problem is, it's very interesting to me that the same people who are against genetically modified food are perfectly willing to inject themselves with genetically engineered insulin if they're diabetics, or to inject genetically engineered monoclonal antibodies if they have, you know, various kinds of lymphomas and so on. So there seems to be this emotional disconnect between medicine, which they feel they absolutely need, and food, where, you know, they think that they're suspicious. And we need to sort of fight this irrationality. Another argument that I think Rich didn't make is that the GM people say, well, there's plenty of food to feed the entire planet. It's just that most of it is being wasted, and if we just stop the waste, we wouldn't need GM crops. Now, people have done a projection of how much you can actually save by removing all of the wastage, and then calculated what is the incremental growth in population by 2050. And it turns out that even if we were to be very efficient and had the sort of gains that we're seeing with normal methods, we would fall short. So the reality is, if we're going to feed the planet, we are going to need new technologies. Now, a point that Rich made that I'd really like to emphasize is there's this dislike of dependency on foreign companies and multinational businesses who have only their own interests at heart, because they are, after all, corporations accountable to their shareholders. There's that dislike, which is perfectly understandable, from the technology that's been used. And in fact, if you look at the GM implementation by Monsanto and other companies, it's not particularly targeted with India in mind. And my point is the same as Rich's, that if India chooses to go into GM, it can do so itself and improve crops that are relevant to India, improve the nutritional value of crops, make them more drought tolerant, make them more tolerant to salinity and pH, which are also problems along with climate change and other things. And this way, GM could be used in the service of the Indian population rather than in the service of other foreign entities. So these are all things to consider.
Thank you. Harold? Comment from Venki, then we will...
And I think the Indian government realized some time ago that a decision it had made, previous governments had made decades earlier, of funding research mainly at central institutes and away from universities was a mistake. And in response to that, the government decided to establish entirely new types of institutes which combine research and education, and these are the so-called ICERs. Now, the problem with that is the scale, as I pointed out, 25 million new students a year, and even about if 10% of them go into STEM subjects, that's still an enormous number of students. So another possibility, I'm not sure you're going to be able to fund research on that kind of scale spread out throughout, say, dozens or hundreds of state universities. But another possibility is something that has been very successfully followed in the US. The US is known for its excellent four-year college system. Many great scientists have come out of four-year colleges rather than research universities. I mean, one example is Harold Varmus, who went to Amherst College. Now, many of these colleges, now Amherst does do research, but many colleges don't actually do a lot of research. But both the faculty and the students go and do research projects every year at major research places. They go to NIH, they go to government national labs, or they go to research universities. And that way they get exposure to current thinking, and students get exposure to research. Teachers stay up to date with the field. And that's a way that might be possible to implement in India, where people from, sort of non-research establishments can still stay in touch with modern methods and modern science, and undergraduates can get training in research by spending, say, summers. And in fact, that's really how I did summer research. I was given a scholarship called the National Science Talent Scholarship, and we were sent off to summer schools every summer, where we had to do research projects and learn, extracurricular science. And so that's a model that could, I think, be scaled up. Well, I think that India has a particular opportunity in studying its own population and its individual and genomic susceptibility to various metabolic diseases. It also has an opportunity to understand microbial pathogenesis, especially for diseases like TB, which affect India, and as well as potentially vaccine development, although we've heard how vaccine development is really quite problematic. There are many viruses and bacteria that don't yield a good vaccine, but nevertheless, it's well worth tackling.